Hello, welcome to the conversation in News Central Television. There's a program where we bring you up to speed with all the political happenings on the African continent. I am Gbenga, Aborowa.
And I'm Rita, Omodia. Today on the conversation, we will be discussing the current standing of the African peace mission to Russia and Ukraine, whose proposals have been rejected by both the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Later on the show, we will discuss the outcome of the Ethiopian committee set up to investigate the diversion of humanitarian food in the region, as the United States and World Food Programme have announced the suspension of aid. Very busy situation over the weekend.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, throughout the week from on Friday when we started the conversations with African delegation, we saw South African presidents, Senegal, Zambia, all trying to bring a peace deal. But from what I saw, I mean, the two sides had different reactions to all of it. And, Vladimir Putin said they weren't the ones who started the whole war. He still blamed it on Ukrainian president.
It's a back and forth. They went, they saw, but did they conquer? Did they achieve their objectives? I guess our distinguished analysts will be able to shed more perspective and light on the situation. And also the second story in Ethiopia. It's so sad after going through civil war and all of that. You expect the aid that is meant for the most vulnerable should get to them. And United States Development Agency, USAID and World Food Programme, they have strict measures. They don't, I mean, what's the point of sending aid if it's going to be diverted? And it's sad that they've suspended food aid to Ethiopia because it's going to affect millions of people.
Definitely. I wonder if there were other measures that they could have taken because, yes, the food has been diverted, but you suspending the aid, at the end, the people are still the ones who suffer the brunt of it also. Why not call for further investigations before suspending it?
They've investigated, they've warned, and I guess that's it now. So, yeah.
All right.
Okay, we begin with our first story where South African President Cyril Ramaphosa led a delegation comprising leaders from Egypt, the Republic of Congo, Senegal, Zambia, Uganda and Comoros to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin, delivering a resolute message that the war in Ukraine must be resolved through diplomatic means. Ramaphosa presented a comprehensive 10-point African peace initiative outlining measures aimed at fostering confidence building and finding a solution to the conflict.
Despite encountering mixed responses from African nations and facing rejection from European leaders regarding their peace mission, Ramaphosa steadfastly emphasized the pressing need to halt the war, given its detrimental impact on the African continent and its far-reaching implications for nations around the world. And joining us for this conversation, we have Calvin Duck, is a global affairs analyst. He joins us from Washington, D.C. in the United States. We also have Alassane Ba, a Pan-African activist. He joins us from the Senegal capital, Dakar. Gentlemen, welcome to the conversation.
Good to be here.
Thank you. And I'm going to begin with you, Calvin. There's been a lot of talks concerning this peace delegation. So first of all, what exactly is the significance of South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa's visit to Russia in the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine? And what message does it convey to the international community?
Well, I think the message that it should convey is there's a misconception that, this war is only between Ukraine, the West, NATO, and Russia, and that somehow this is not Africa's war. But it is. And I say that because Africa's involved because it affects Africans. And so I think that just the attempt to be a mediating force to try to bring this conflict to an end for the benefit of African countries sends a very powerful message. However, I like to be optimistic about what can come from things. So I'll try to keep that optimism. I'll just say that this step is one of many that will have to take place, not just by African countries, but by other countries and groups of countries around the world.
Thank you, Calvin. Now I'd like to bring in Alassane and Dakar. Now, Alassane, could you provide us with an analysis of the divisions amongst African countries in the response to the Ukraine conflict? How have they voted at the United Nations General Assembly? And what factors do you think are influencing their positions? And how might these divisions based on the Ukraine conflict impact regional dynamics?
Okay, first of all, thank you. And I'm welcoming also my brother from USA. And I would like also to underline that the situation of the African countries to participate actually in this war, it is I mean the mission of peace that they are trying to do, especially the coming of the president of South Africa. It is something to let know the South Africa is showing its leadership in as a new Africa, a new country, core country in Africa, and also for all the participants, even if it is not the decision of the UA, the African Union, I mean, officially, it was only the decision of some African leaders like Macky Sall and others, his leaders. And that can show also their interest to negotiate with the Russia and so this is actually we can say the serial, how you call it in French, the serial that became at the time low prices, and the problem of eating became a big problem in and it is sometimes an interest to go and participate in negotiations. Yeah.
All right, Alassane, I mean, you're talking more about how this war affects Africa, and this is one of the reasons why we had this delegation, especially when it comes to food production and importation. Now, Calvin, let's go straight into the discussions at this meeting. I mean, on one side, people are looking at how successful exactly was this African delegation. We had lots of talks even before then. I mean, what happened in Poland and all of that. Now we see Ukrainian president and the Russian president, and one side, the Ukrainian president talked about Russian president, giving back those areas that have been withheld by Moscow. On the other side, we see Russia's president saying that Ukraine's president was the one that actually started this war. So what exactly were the costs and implications of this peace agreement that was given by the African delegation?
Well, I think that one of the things we say here in Washington, D.C. is everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not everybody's entitled to their own facts. What we have to realize is that Ukraine and Russia, if they come to the negotiating table, are not coming on an equal footing. What I mean by that is Russia is the aggressor. This is a war that Russia created and could end today. And so when we look at Ukraine saying that it is a non-starter if any peace deal, any negotiation presented by African leaders or otherwise includes ceding territory to Russia, the international community should acknowledge that. That's territorial integrity. And so just because Russia says it won't come to the table because its needs aren't met, we have to acknowledge it's the aggressor. So I think that African countries have to treat Russia as such. I thought that it was really interesting that one of the things Ukrainian President Zelensky pointed out during the African leaders' visit was that there was heavy shelling. And he said, you're going to Russia to meet with Putin, and he's firing missiles at you. He knows you're here. I think that says a lot as to what Putin really wants and how much support he gives African countries that are trying to mediate. I think that African countries' influence as far as Putin is concerned, is their support on the diplomatic front. And I think that African countries should use that leverage to their advantage.
Thank you, Calvin Dark. Alassane, now President Zelensky, Ukrainian president, expressed his rejection of any prospect of a ceasefire while Russian forces remain on Ukrainian territory. What are the underlying reasons for Ukraine's stance on this? Hello, Alassane Ba, are you there? Kindly unmute your device, please.
I am here. Thank you. I would like actually to come back on on the question and summarize it, because I had just a little problem in the workplace. Just summarizing about what you were telling to me, questions.
Okay, I'll direct that question to Calvin, while we try to get Alassane back on the conversation. Now, Calvin, I asked Alassane why President Zelensky did reject the proposal that, you know, we're not going to accept any ceasefire until Russia stops its aggression. What do you make of this? And what's the underlying reason behind that notion?
Well, I think that what Zelensky realizes is just a reality on the ground that if they agree to, say, a ceasefire for diplomatic talks without Russia withdrawing, Russia has leverage. You know, I often think about it as somebody breaking into my house and saying, we're going to negotiate how I leave, but I've got to stay in the house until we do that. It sets up a situation where Russia, it's all for Russia's side. If they like what's on the negotiation table, they accept it. If they don't, they still stay there. So that's why Zelensky is pushing that. And, you know, I don't blame him. That's what the Ukrainians have asked for. I do think that one powerful message from the proposal that the African leaders presented was this war has to end, and acknowledging that both Russia and Ukraine have their non-starters, but this isn't just affecting them, it's affecting people around the world, particularly in African countries. And so I think maybe that is a message that Zelensky should take to heart, as well as Putin, that this continued conflict is hurting more people than just Russians and Ukrainians.
Exactly. Now, following up on what you said, Calvin, this war has been dragging on for more than a year, and it seems both sides are adamant to reach any compromise or agreement. And like you said, it's affecting people in Africa and different parts of the world. So what will it take to end this conflict? Because the barrage of sanctions on Russia, the military aid to Ukraine from the world superpowers, I mean, from NATO and America, every other day you hear about, you know, billions of dollars being spent on weaponry and all of that. It doesn't seem to be making any headway. It's almost like they're bogged down in a stalemate. So what will it take to bring this war to an end?
I think what it's going to take is international pressure and isolation of Russia on the international stage. Now, let me tell you, a lot of friends and colleagues that I have are on the continent, you know, Africans. And when we talk about this, one of the things that they always remind me is that a lot of African countries and the people in those countries want to take a neutral stance because they don't see this as their war. They don't want to be forced into, for example, having to support the West or Europe or the United States. And I totally get that. But my argument is African countries shouldn't be neutral for a different reason. They should realize that in this situation, what best benefits African countries? And in this situation, Russia stopping this war so that food insecurity is not such a challenge as it is now with the Ukrainian conflict, that's why African countries should use their diplomatic influence at the UN and on the international stage to pressure Russia. So I would recommend stop seeing it as, oh, therefore the Americans are for NATO. I would say, see it as they are for Africans, because that, in this situation, is the best outcome for African people. So I think putting that diplomatic pressure and isolating Russia is going to be the most effective way of ending this conflict.
Now, talking about this diplomatic pressure, I mean, South Africa's President Ramaphosa, along with the African delegation, they went with a 10-point peace plan. So what exactly sets us aside from all the peace proposals that we've had?
Well, I think one of the things that also is a big hurdle is, you know, obviously with the main thrust of the peace proposal is, you know, to end the conflict and, you know, that this has a diplomatic political end. But what's the subtext of it is, do the people offering the mediation have the credibility they need? And that by that I mean, are the people, the stakeholders, and this includes some of the African leaders, do they have, as we say in the United States, a particular dog in the fight one way or the other? And I think that their perceptions, you know, particularly from the United States, about, take South Africa, for example, what their motives are. You know, they have been more close to Russia on this side. Of course, a lot of things about that South Africa has disagreed with. I think that African countries need to make their positions clear, and they need to address these issues of credibility, because I know from the Ukrainian side, for example, they rightly so are weary of trusting the delegation completely because they know that there's not a homogeneous agreement among African countries as to how this war should end, who started it, and who is continuing it.
Now, Calvin, how have the prices of commodities, fuel and grain, been affected by the ongoing conflict in Ukraine? What broader implications does this have for the global markets and regional stability?
I think that, you know, what started to happen when the Ukrainian conflict began, when Russia invaded, you know, that was also, we were still in the COVID pandemic economy, not just here in the United States, but around the world. And what I think happened is, obviously, the conflict put pressure, particularly on grains and fertilizers, that disrupted those markets. Now, it affected everybody around the world. However, some economies were better able to deal with it than others. And so I think what's happening now is Africa is bearing most of the economic brunt of the disruption in the commodities, you know, grain and fertilizer. I do think that what African countries need to pay attention to is, one of the things Putin said was he blamed it on everybody else but him, saying that economic disruption for those commodities is because of the US and because of Europe and NATO, when I don't think that's true. And I think that Africans need to think about that when they are playing this role of mediator as to who is really responsible. Because once again, I think African countries need to do what's best for Africa's best interest, and particularly on the issue of food insecurity.
Now, Calvin, earlier on, you talked about the integrity of the African peace delegation. You also talked about, you know, how there's been so much pressure on South Africa, especially from the United States, of which they claim that this non-aligned position of South Africa seems to fall more on the Russian side. We see so much relations with it. And we also remember that there's been an indictment of the Russian President Vladimir Putin by the ICC. Now, President Ramaphosa mentioned the indictment of President Putin regarding the alleged deportation of Ukrainian children. So how does this, or how will it affect the peace process that President Ramaphosa came to do in Russia and Ukraine?
For those 2 points, I find it very interesting. For the first one, with the children that were kidnapped, essentially, I thought that Putin's response to that, you know, something to the effect of Russia was just trying to save them from being victims of the conflict, so they took them, makes no sense. And that is a definite war crime. But on the other point that you made about the arrest warrant with the ICC, I think that could be a realistic way to move this forward. I know there was talk about maybe as a part of bringing people to the negotiating table, there would be a pause or maybe change about this arrest warrant. I actually think that's a good idea, not because I don't think Putin should be held accountable for war crimes, but that is so against Putin that look, if we can end this conflict and start addressing the insecurity of agricultural insecurity that is brought on, and the price we have to pay is that Putin has to stay in Russia and not be in a jail somewhere in the ICC, I'm fine with that. And so I think that is a good starting point. It just doesn't seem to be anything that Putin is willing to accept as a condition of coming to the negotiating table.
Thank you, Calvin. I'd like to attempt to speak to Alassane. I hope you're still there. Now, Alassane, earlier during our conversation, Calvin did suggest that, you know, Africans should pick the side of Ukraine, that they shouldn't stay neutral in this situation, because if they support Ukraine, it might lead to less food insecurity and water view. But in the course of this debate, we've heard a lot of Africans say, look, we remember our history. We also look at the hypocrisy of the United States, you know, going to the United States, United Nations Security Council and saying that, you know, Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and then years down the line, it turned out to be false. They also remember NATO's intervention in Libya and the blowback, and how it's affected African countries. So do you agree with the line of thought of Calvin that, you know, Africans should toe the line of Ukraine and throw their weight behind Ukraine instead of being neutral in the situation? What's your thoughts, Alassane? Hello, Alassane, are you there?
Hello, I'm excusing for this bad connection because I get you sometime badly, and maybe if you could back on the question, that will be important for me because I'm
Okay,
dealing with my cell
I
phone
will
and
repeat.
it's
I will
taking.
repeat the question, Alassane. My question was: your co-panelist Calvin Dack did suggest that
Yeah.
Africans should support Ukraine and not stay neutral in this conflict between Ukraine and Russia, so as to guarantee its food security and other issues. What's your take on this? Do you agree with him or disagree?
No, I do better.
Alison, can you hear us? Okay, I think Calvin, let's look more about this issue here because you know we've had situations of this non-aligned neutrality, and you talk so much about let Africa not face the aggressor, but rather the person who is being a victim in this particular war. But at the same time, we see African countries say we don't want to get in the midst of all of this, and we also see a situation where we talk about Africa not being a play tool for global superpowers. So give us specific reasons why Africa should not play a neutral ground into this whole situation and debacle going on.
Yes, now I totally agree, and I say this as an American. If we look at, let's say in theory, on paper, the United States has not always fulfilled its obligations to those who supported the United States position on the international stage. The United States also has not always followed up on its commitment to be there when countries do take a stand, you know, against a particular movement or against another country. I think that's totally legitimate. However, in practice, we have to face the reality that because of Putin invading Ukraine, we now have two sides in this conflict. We have the side of NATO in the West, the United States, and we have the side of Russia. And while in theory, there should be a lane for people to be non-aligned, in practice, that lane doesn't exist. I personally, one of the reasons why I want African countries to take more of a stand for Ukraine is because, as you've seen, the United States being the major one, but not just the United States, European countries as well, let their perception that Africa isn't on the US and Europe side affect other areas. Because we have this mentality of you're either with us or against us. I don't think that's a fair way to look at it, but I think that's the reality. So that's why I think African countries need to basically pick the horse in this race that best helps them. And I think in this case, it's definitely not Russia or Putin.
Thank you very much. Calvin Dark, a global affairs analyst, joining live from Washington, D.C. And also Alassane Ba, Pan-African activist, joining live from Dakar in Senegal. It's been a pleasure having you both gentlemen join us on the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.